Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted this morning to be with Professor Doug Axe. How are you doing, Doug?
I'm doing very well. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining me on the live stream. It's the first time I've had you on. I've had pretty much most of the people from Discovery. Well, actually, I can't say most because actually the team's quite wide. But it's lovely to have you. I've been following your work for many, many years, and we're going to be talking about your book, Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed. So, just before we get into the book, I'm going to bore you. I'm sure you've heard this many, many times, but I'm sure the audience would like to know who you are. Actually, in fact, I think many of them would already know who you are. So, Doug Axe is the Rosa Endowed Chair of Molecular Biology at Baylor University, the founding director of the Biologic Institute, the founding editor of Biocomplexity, and the author of Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed. After completing his PhD at Caltech, he held postdoctoral and research science positions at the University of Cambridge and the Cambridge Medical Research Council Centre. His research, which examines the functional and structural constraints on the evolution of proteins and protein systems, has been featured in many scientific journals, including the Journal of Molecular Biology, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Biocomplexity, and Nature, and in such books as Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt by Stephen Meyer, and Life's Solution by Simon Conway Morris. Delighted to be speaking to you this morning. So let's get into it. Um,
Okay.
this book has to be one of the favorite um, books on this particular topic, I think. And for me, the reason that is the case is because you bring it for the laity, you bring it for the commoner. It's something I can speak to someone at a pedestrian level, or we can take it much higher. It builds a very strong base. So, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, let's see. It was multiple years in the making, even the inspiration, and then it was like a year and a half to actually write it. And as you know, and as I say in the book, I've been involved in laboratory technical research, um, offering a critical or attempting a critical analysis of whether Darwinism works at the molecular level, and publishing papers along the way. And I reached a point where I felt like we had reached a conclusion from the laboratory work and the mathematical modeling. And then I had this opportunity to write a book and this came through my friendship with Stephen Meyer, who's written books with HarperCollins. And since we're close colleagues, an opportunity landed on my lap to offer a proposal. And when that was granted, and now I can spend some time rolling up my sleeves and writing a book, I started to think about what should this book be. And on the one hand, I could go with a sort of distillation or a non-technical translation of technical work, but I felt as though that would be playing into this um, myth that on this most crucial of questions, are we cosmic accidents or are we the products of a personal intelligent designer, that the myth is that that is a technical question for experts to answer, and that non-experts cannot answer it because they're not qualified. And I felt like if I am only appealing to expert peer-reviewed evidence and saying, here's what I found, then I'm playing into this ping pong match where people read it and they either agree with me or they disagree. If they disagree, then they look for experts who are saying the opposite. And if they agree with me, they're going to be confronted by experts who say the opposite. And you're left, if you're not an expert, and you buy this myth, which I say is a myth, not not really having it resolved, because you can be rooting for one ping pong player or the other, but it just goes back and forth. And I started to get this conviction that that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to say, no, you non-experts, you already know the truth here, and there's a way that you know it. And that's why I start with and the subtitle mentions intuition, undeniable: how biology confirms our intuition that life is designed. And I started with that, not because an intuition proves something, but because we all have it. If we're honest, we have this. And even psychologists have studied this in young kids before they start school. They look at the world around them, they see a dragonfly in the garden, and they say that was made by a godlike designer. And they say that regardless of their upbringing, they do not have to be brought up in a religious background to see this. So it's something that humans see from an early age. And I said, that's it. I want to start with that, show that that's there, it's acknowledged as being there, and then see if we can find a way to say, well, underneath that is something of substance, that people are, they're not being crazy. When a 4-year-old says that butterflies are made by a godlike designer, that's not crazy talk. That's actually very commonsensical. Can we show that it's commonsensical in a way that also touches or connects to the technical work that shows not only is it commonsensical, it actually proves true if you go in the lab and you do the technical work. That's a long-winded answer, but that's kind of the strategy that came to my mind is start with the common sense and show that there's actually something true behind it, and then layer in the technical work.
Brilliant, brilliant. I love that introduction. So the natural question stemming from your reply to the last one is, why should we take our intuition seriously?
I think we just naturally do, but I have to emphasize that I'm not saying in the book that every intuition you have is true, because they're not. Our intuitions are quite fallible. But it's interesting that this seems to be a universal intuition. And if someone claims that humans have something as a universal intuition, at the very least, I have to say, I think everyone has to acknowledge that's interesting. Why do all humans sense that this is correct? And again, the book is not saying we all sense this is correct, therefore it's correct. The book is saying, isn't that interesting that we all sense this is correct? Could there be something behind it? And so I take the technical work and say, well, yes, there is. It's actually proven true. But I also acknowledge the 4-year-old's not doing anything technical when they see the butterfly. That he or she is just doing what comes naturally. They're saying, well, somebody did this. Someone had to have done this. And that's another interesting thing is, okay, this proves true in a technical sense, but for a non-technical young human observer of the world, what's going on that makes this so clear and so obvious? And it turns out that there's a connection between the two. There is something clear and obvious, and you're actually doing work when you're getting your undergraduate degree in the life sciences or your graduate degrees. You're having to do work against what you know to be true in order to override it and say, no, that's false and that's childish. I now know and understand life at a deeper level, when in fact you don't.
Absolutely. Great way of putting it. So in the beginning of the book, you go over, this type of contention, which comes quite early on in terms of who is the designer. And this is in fact something which I recently, I did a video on this when Richard Dawkins was attacking Dembski. He was saying, well, look at these guys. They're trying to basically smuggle in God. And, they need to tell us who, they're trying to tell one audience we know who the designer is, and they're trying to tell another audience they don't know who the designer is. And this obviously dovetails into the question of what is the difference between ID and creationism.
Yeah, and that's a good question. It's an important distinction to make. So, and there's multiple strands, of course, of creationism. Here in the U.S., I'm not sure it's the same situation in the UK, but in the US, you have people who call themselves young Earth creationists, and they're the ones who think that the Earth is thousands of years old, not billions, and old Earth creationists, but they think that God made it. Old Earth creationists agree that God made the Earth and everything, but that the timeline is what you would read in a textbook, billions of years old, not thousands of years old. Intelligent design is not specifically aiming at that question, the age of the earth, or at the question, how do you read the book of Genesis in the Bible? Intelligent design is just saying, if we do the science of origins carefully and honestly, what does it reveal? And the fact is, it reveals that there are things around us, including us, that cannot be properly explained as a product of mere physical processes. We cannot be cosmic accidents, nor can we be the products of just physics doing what physics does. We have to have been deliberately and brilliantly conceived. So you could picture the relationship between intelligent design and young and old Earth creationism as a Venn diagram, where the big circle is affirming design as true, and then there would be two circles within that would be the young Earth and old Earth. Both of them affirm that design is true, but they're more focused on reconciling the Genesis account with science. And the ID program generally is not is that's a special focus that those two creationist camps have. That's not necessarily a focus of someone who holds to intelligent design. And kind of what brought intelligent design to the forefront is its focus on just doing the science well and letting the science speak for itself instead of trying to marry up the science with scripture.
Brilliant. Okay, so that segues into a related question of universal common ancestry. Is it necessary for someone to reject universal common ancestry to accept the ID claim about features of biological life being designed?
No. And I have colleagues, well, one that I know who's famous is Michael Behe. Uh, Michael Behe is very much an intelligent design advocate. He's a person of faith. He's a Catholic believer, but he accepts the tree of life. So he accepts that there is universal common ancestry, but he rejects the idea that Darwin's mechanism could have taken some simple bacterium and turned it into everything we see around us. So what
Right.
he's saying instead is there has to have been intelligent input in order to drive um, life along all these splitting branches to see into the living things that we see around us today. I don't
Mm.
take that to be true. I think there's lots of problems with that, but there are people who accept intelligent design and also the tree of life.
Brilliant. And for anyone who's interested, I have a series, I think it's 9 or 10 parts with Paul Nelson on testing universal common ancestry. Um, oh, by the way, I believe Michael Denton also accepts universal
Yes,
common
very
ancestry.
likely.
Yeah. Okay. Another point which I think is important to clarify is um, you're not referring to theistic evolution here. This is different to the ideas of Francis Collins and others who are, trying to accept a form of design alongside uh, Darwinism.
Yes, and there again, there's complexity to all these titles. The titles are the labels are helpful until they're not, and they become less helpful when you realize there's real complexity to the landscape. So, some people would refer to the position that I just described to Michael Behe as being theistic evolution because he does accept a tree of life. So that's evolution of a kind, but it's not blind evolution. So it would be reasonable to call Michael Behe's position a theistic evolution position. That's not the position, I take it, that Francis Collins, the people at BioLogos, the position that I think is more squarely associated with the term theistic evolution is that fine tuning argument is great for establishing that the universe could not be here apart from God having made it. Um, but they accept that once a universe with these properties exists, that natural processes will produce simple life, and natural processes, even Darwinian processes, will produce complex life from simple life and eventually intelligent life, us. So I'm my position is very far removed from Francis Collins' position. And if we took, say, if we took, say, Richard Dawkins or a classic Darwinist atheist position, the point where Collins and Dawkins disagree is on how do you get a universe. And Dawkins says, well, I don't know what he say. He might say a multiverse or something. Some natural process produces universe. Collins and kind of the classic theistic evolution position would be no, you have to have divinity in order for there to be a universe. But that's the one point where they would disagree on everything after that. As time unfolds, I think you would find a Collins position being very much in agreement with a Dawkins position. The difference being that Collins is saying because this is a universe that has design behind it, all of these follow-on effects that you rightly attribute to Darwin's um, mechanism should ultimately be attributed to God, because he's the one who produced a universe that has these properties. And there I disagree, because I say, given a universe with these properties, you don't get life. There's something on top. Yes, I totally agree that fine tuning means a universe can't happen by accident. But I also say that when the 4-year-old sees the butterfly, he or she is seeing something that is way beyond just physics being physics. They're seeing something physical that has taken form that could only have been informed by someone who knew what they were doing.
Yeah, brilliant. Um, for anyone who's interested to follow on the discussion between Collins and Dawkins, they actually had a debate on Premier Radio. And I mean, I think Francis Collins got a leg over him in that debate. So there's something you write on in a very categorical way. You say the scientific facts are in complete harmony with the universal design intuition. As as someone who may be watching this, who's a non-expert, they don't know the technicalities, they may say, well, I find that a bit hard to believe because we have all these experts. Like for the commoner, the experts are, Jerry Coyne and Richard Dawkins and others. And they would say, well, Doug, they don't seem to agree. They don't believe it's in harmony. What would you respond to that?
Yeah, and that's a very good observation. And I devoted a chunk of the book. Well, let me back up and say, in my own kind of career work, I started off. I call it. What do I call it? I think I call it the utopian view of science, or something like that. This idea that scientists are, yes, they're people with all the quirks that humans have, but they put those quirks aside when they go into the laboratory. And when they go in the laboratory, they're after the truth, and they do experiments, if they're experimentalists, to try to understand what the truth is. And if those experiments force them to recognize that their thinking was wrong, then they recognize it and they move forward kind of in this steady progression, closer and closer approach to the truth. And I recognized, the more I worked as a scientist and worked with scientists and looked at how results can challenge ideas, that's not that's not how humans operate. Humans don't just believe things to be true, they want things to be true. They don't just hold things to be true, they sometimes dearly hold things to be true. So as persons, we get attached to what we think is true, and we kind of construct something very significant, namely our lives and how we go about doing things, around the things that we take to be true. Given that, it's not going to be the case that if you challenge something that's at the root of how someone sees himself or herself and all of reality, they're not going to say, oh, okay, I guess I have to change my view of reality. We just don't operate that way. We become invested in our view of reality, which means even if there is a whole line of research that's showing something foundational that you believe is probably false, you're going to push back against it. And you'll push back against it personally, because that's how humans operate, but you'll also socially, to the degree that you can, construct a culture that pushes back against it. And that's what you have in the scientific community. The scientific community consists of humans. Humans are political. Humans build culture. Humans use culture to exert influence. And that means the scientific community is a culture that at times is going to harm science. It's going to push against something that, if we were all thinking as pure scientists, we would say, no, you shouldn't push back against this. This should be allowed to go forward, and we should test to see which is true. But if you don't want it to go forward because you don't want that to be true and you want this to be true, then you use all the power you can use, all the power you can muster within your community to prevent that idea from going forward. And that sounds very ugly. And I think people who aren't scientists encounter that idea with disbelief sometimes. But really, if you step back and think, what are humans? Is there any group of humans where there's power and prestige and fame and money at stake that doesn't get political? I can't think of a single example. So why would science be the one place where it doesn't get ugly at times? It's not. It does get ugly at times. So if you take that into account, it is perfectly possible for the people in the positions of power in the scientific academy to be um, very carefully and deliberately pushing forward an idea that the science actually says is false. And that sounds very shocking at first, but when you think about it and look at specific examples, it should have been obvious all along.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that's quite unique about your book, how much detail you go into in regards to this particular area. So this is chapter 5 for anyone who's interested. And just to add to your point, Doug, um, if we look back at the Darwinists themselves, Julian Huxley's book, Religion Without Revelation, Mary Midgley, Evolution as Religion, Darwinism as Religion by Michael Ruse, or The Blind Watchmaker, Richard Dawkins himself speaks about atheism being propped up for him by Darwin's ideas. So clearly there's something ideological here. And, you're basically making the argument they're humans. So, of
Yeah.
course, they're going to be, making these types of points. And there's something you say here, which um, I love, and I want to read out, because you're essentially saying that nobody has a monopoly on thinking, right? People who lack formal scientific credentials are nonetheless qualified to speak with authority on matters of common science. I absolutely love that quote.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we go back to the tennis match or the ping pong match, this is what I was very not at all content to think that a very small minority of human beings are entrusted with answering some of the most important questions, like how did we get here and what are we as humans? That can't be the case. That has to be a question that we all own, and we all own it because very commonsensical thinking plays into it. And so I wanted to empower people with the book. I wanted the book to be something that true experts could read, even experts who disagree with me, and be made uncomfortable, because I wanted them to see that actually the facts don't side with you if you're a Darwinist. But I also wanted to write the book for someone who's not at all an expert who cares, and let that person see you can't just outsource your beliefs to your favorite team of experts. You have to look at this yourself, and you can look at this and land on a position that you know to be true. So that's a big part of the book. A Dose of Common Science. That's the title of chapter 5.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, you've contributed significantly to the field yourself. You've published in Nature, and for a lot of people who don't know, Nature is considered the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. And of course, a Life Solution, published by Cambridge University, and Simon Conway Morris has referred to your work as well. Could you tell the audience about your work on proteins and how that helped you shape a design argument in your book?
Yeah, let me first correct one thing. I don't have a paper that got published in Nature. What happened instead was I had a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that a colleague, a very prestigious scientist in Cambridge, did a Nature News and Views on. So there's a paper in Nature that is talking about a result that I got, but my result was not published in Nature. Not that that's a big deal, but
Yeah, sorry, I just misread that. That's my fault.
no,
Apologies.
because
Yeah.
I've said before that this idea has been discussed in Nature, but it's not this. It's not something that I authored. It's someone else who authored, and they discussed this work. So your question was, how did my work on proteins
Yeah.
connect to this?
Yeah.
Well, the whole reason I started working on proteins was I was trained up as an engineer, not as a molecular biologist. And as an engineer, when I first encountered molecular genetics, I remember being in a lecture. This was at Caltech here in California, Southern California. I was in a lecture as a graduate student where the professor was explaining how cells have an ingenious mechanism for controlling the level to which a gene is turned on. So Cells can turn genes off or they can turn them on, and they want to turn them on. So I'll speak in teleological terms. A cell wants to turn a gene on if it needs more of the product that that gene makes. Okay, and that's how an engineer would think about this. You want the machine to do this. You want your computer to do this. And when I saw the mechanism, this is at a molecular scale that cells have in order to sense whether they need more of the product of this gene or not, and then control by proteins binding to DNA and RNA, control how much of the product is made, as if it's got it's a regulatory circuit of the kind that I had studied as an engineer. And there's something called control systems theory. I'd studied that as an engineering student, and I thought this is a control system, but it's a control system that's far more remarkable than anything I ever saw before as an engineer, because it's single molecules implementing this control system. And that's what got me thinking, first of all, I do not believe that this just happened by chance. Someone who has the mind of an engineer, but more brilliant than any human engineer, did this. But I also started thinking, how would you go about proving this? Proving that this can't just happen by accident, by a Darwinian process. And that led me down the line of thinking, well, what could you do with single genes in a laboratory that would shed light on this? And this was I first started thinking along these lines in the 1980s, and this was about the time that some very powerful techniques for manipulating DNA were becoming available. So the 1980s was the big boom of biotech, and you had these companies springing up, and it was, cloning and recombinant DNA technology. And I was following all this very closely because I was in a grad school where I was in biotechnology. But I started to become more interested in using these technologies to do an experiment rather than to start a biotech company. And so I went the direction of molecular biology. That's what landed me in Cambridge. But the experiment basically was, can I take a gene that has the sequence instructions for cells to make a protein that does something, and can I mess it up millions of different ways and put these messed up genes in bacterial cells and let them tell me whether the thing still works or not? Because if I can let them do the work of telling me whether it works or not, I can get numbers from an experiment that would allow me to come up with a probability that something that's entirely messed up would or would not work. So that's what got me into proteins. I wasn't a protein scientist who then stumbled upon the question of evolution. It was the other way around. I was fascinated with testing evolution, and that's what led me to study proteins.
Brilliant. I just want to take you back to the beginning of your answer. You said you're using teleological language, the cell wants to. And it just reminded me of JBS Haldane's statement that, teleology is a mistress for the biologist. He can't live without her.
You can't get away from it when you're looking at things that clearly want to do things and are doing the things that they want to do. And when they're not doing what they want to do, they're broken. It's pathological, and you can see that. So you can't really do biology without thinking in those terms.
Absolutely. And in River Out of Eden, Dawkins himself says that purpose in biology is so powerful. It's a good working tool. And likewise, we have many other biologists, including Francis Crick, who are alluding to this. I just wanted your thoughts on something. We are often told by the followers of scientism that science is true because it works. Yet design as a research heuristic works. We use it all the time. You can't live without it. So maybe design is true by the same logic as the argument for scientific realism.
There's also an interesting thing. Having come from engineering, I've come to view technology and science as being two different things. And they're often conflated. So really, when someone says science works, I think probably what they're thinking is technology works. Smartphones work. Okay? And the person on the street says, yes, science gave us smartphones. It's really, I would distinguish between science as an academic pursuit, which is simply trying to understand what's true about the natural world. How does the natural world work? versus these very powerful applications of what can we do with the natural world? What sorts of things can we manufacture? How can we get computers to work now? How can we get quantum computers to work? There's a science connection there, but the fact that technology works really affirms design very powerfully, because technology doesn't work apart from design. And I'm not sure if you ask the person on the street, to what extent does science work apart from technology? I'm not sure what they would answer. They've probably heard that the Higgs boson was discovered, but does anyone on the street know whether that's true or not? I don't. I think a lot of these things that science produces, people would be hard pressed to say, "Well, yes, I know from my experience that that's true." Apart from the things that we've always known are true. What people do know and are impressed with, rightly, is technology works, but technology is applying design for sure. So I think it is an affirmation of design.
Absolutely. That's a brilliant answer. Um, I'm going to jump to your section on language as the ultimate medium of invention. I thought this was a really interesting part of your book. Could you elaborate on this point?
Yes. Um, Language, well, we know, we think of language as distinguishing our species from everything else. Okay. And you'll read things that, honeybees have a dance language for locating nectar sources. And you'll read about Jane Goodall and her work with chimps and other people who work with primates or dolphins. There are a lot of smart animals out there that are not Homo sapiens, but none of them have language. And sometimes you'll read something that's confused on that says, "Oh no, this is language." Um, it isn't language. So there's signaling, and of course, birds and dogs and cats is very familiar to us that animals signal. So there can be something that they do that is observed by others of their species, and it tells them something. So birds have this way of saying there's a predator around, there's a cat around, and they do a click. You'll, if your cat's out in the front yard, you'll hear birds making a weird noise. They're telling other birds there's a cat here. Be careful. And all kinds of animals do this. So someone might say, well, what's the distinction between that and language? The distinction is that language is a set of symbols that's used by people who understand symbolism. Okay, so um, remember the famous Pavlov's dog. I mean,
Yeah.
if you ring a bell before you give a dog food routinely, you can reach a point where the dog expects food when the dog hears the bell, and so they'll start the dog will drool when it hears a bell. But that's not language. That's a symbol. A symbol is a connection the dog makes. When I hear a bell, food is coming. A signal is different from a symbol. A symbol is infinitely um, versatile in its use, and the user of symbols thinks of them symbolically. So, what language allows us to do is not just say, oh, food is coming. You can say anything you want with language. We get a finite set, not that large, of symbols that we call words. And a language is constructed so that you could say whatever you want about anything at all with words. And dogs can't do that. Chimps can't do that. No other creature can do that. So the way we do this is we have a symbol set that's in common. We're both speaking English right now. For any language, there's a symbol set that all speakers of the language have in common. And what we're doing is coming up with ideas that can be arbitrarily complex. And I'm not saying it's easy to take a complex idea and put it into words, but that's what language allows you to do. For me to take a complex idea, put it into a string of symbols, hand that off to someone who understands the same symbol set, and let them reconstruct a complex idea in their mind. And that's a truly remarkable thing. And that's invention at a very, very high level that enables it to work. The other thing I like about it is if you talk about invention and information and all these things that sound very abstract and far removed maybe from everyday experience of someone who's not a scientist or an engineer, but if I say every time you say a sentence, you're inventing. Every time you send a text message, you're inventing. Now you realize, oh, this is something that this is part of being human that we do this.
Absolutely. Brilliant answer there. And if I was to play, you know, I guess the Darwinist position, or the devil's advocate here, and I was to say, "Oh, Doug, this sounds really good, and I can understand where you're coming from, but why don't I have bulletproof skin? Why do I have limited memory? Design isn't perfect according to my understanding, and humans die eventually, and they don't live on forever. We have birth defects, and they try and just use perfection as an argument against design, and make all these sort of bad design arguments. What would your response be? Because that's a pretty common sort of
Yeah.
contention.
Um, I did a short video response to, there's a video by Neil deGrasse Tyson called, I think it's called Stupid Design or something like that. And I did like a 5-minute video response to that. But it's interesting because there's two different ways you can go on this, or two different dysteleology kind of arguments. One is the sort of cancer, illness, things that everyone says, yeah, clearly something's gone wrong here. And that connects to the problem of evil. Okay. Why is there so much that's bad? And the other one, which is quite different, is the bulletproof skin claim. Like, why don't we have bulletproof skin? Neil deGrasse Tyson's um, example of this that I responded to in the video was, we eat through the same opening that we breathe through, and that allows choking to happen. How dumb is that? Okay. You have to answer these in two very different ways, and you can't really. I think, as a theist, as a Christian, I don't think you can answer the cancer, evil, bad thing without doing theology. Okay. And there is a theology of this. So the people who say that this hasn't been treated, it has been treated at length. There's a book in the Bible called the Book of Job, which is talking about this, but there's a lot of deep thinking on this. If I were to give a very quick answer to someone who's say an atheist, and simply trots out the argument, if you believe in a God who's all powerful and all good, how could there be evil? My quick answer would be, in the end, there can't be evil, but this isn't the end. Okay, so that would be my answer. So that's how you resolve that problem. But the other problem, why don't we have bulletproof skin, or why do we have why are we eating through the same opening that we're breathing through? Those are shown to be silly arguments if you just kind of unpack what would bulletproof skin look like. And so if you say, well, bulletproof skin, you're going to imagine like plates of metal or something. Can you think of things that would be awkward if you walked around with plates of metal all around your body? Are there, in other words, they end up being silly arguments. If you want bulletproof skin, you're going to give up something that might be really important about skin, because there are times that you want to feel things with your skin, and that requires skin to be something other than bulletproof. So, in very short statement, what goes wrong with these arguments is a very a complete ignorance of the fact that brilliant design, like all design, involves trade-offs. Okay, all design problems involve trade-offs. If you list everything in the world that you want, no design is going to deliver all that. So you're going to have to decide, if I want to have a stronger suitcase, it's going to be either a heavier suitcase or a more expensive suitcase. And you can't have the cheapest suitcase and the lightest suitcase be the strongest suitcase. You just can't. They live in different quadrants of this space that you have to explore. So design is always about doing a very good job of finding the sweet spot that delivers what you want, by making these compromises very carefully and very brilliantly. And so my answer to deGrasse Tyson's notion of the mouth being a poor design is, well, look what we're doing right now. Right now, I am speaking, and in speaking, I'm using my lips, my tongue, my palate, and my teeth. And I need wind to speak. I have to have air coming out I have to have air coming out in order to speak through the vocal cords. Those are the very same structures, not the vocal cords, but the lips, the teeth, the tongue, the palate. Those are the very same structures that we use to eat. Now, if you ask people who have actually designed things and are accomplished designers, they will tell you there's something brilliant when you can get multiple uses out of the same structures, and that's exactly what we have. The exact same structures that you use to eat are the exact same structures that you use to speak. And to speak, you need to have air. And that is a very good reason for these two systems to be connected in a brilliant way. It's also goofy because although, yes, choking is a possibility, there's so many things in life that something good that you have can also get you in trouble. And I don't know if I mentioned this in that video, but one of the most profound ones for humans is intelligence. And the depth with which humans experience emotion and intelligence can be the best of humanity, and it can be the worst, and it can be our downfall. So depression and all kinds of mental illness come because we are mental creatures. So would you say we shouldn't be mental creatures? Because it's like seeing a downside but ignoring the upside. So that's, again, I hope I touched on the two things. The one
Yeah,
thing, the problem of evil, it has been dealt with in depth, and anyone who ignores that has not done their homework.
yeah, absolutely. And just to add to what you're saying, even if we were to go to the extreme end of not giving a theological answer and simply saying, well, a medieval torture rack, as William Lane Craig has argued during a debate, I think it was with Francis Ayala or someone else, he said, well, we'd still say it's design. Even if we don't like the outcome, we don't like what it's doing, it's still design.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And another thing which I like that Paul Nelson has highlighted is, well, this is really a confusion of the field of discussion from a biological perspective to start getting into the questions about the nature of design and why the designer would do XYZ. You're essentially, trespassing into theology. So let's just admit where we are.
Yeah, when you have atheists doing theology, you're in a weird space, but that's what you have here.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And he also referred to the prophet Job, and I thought that was really interesting because that is actually my standard example to give. So in Arabic we say Yaqub. So it's the
Uh-huh.
same story. It's the same story of Yaqub where he goes through this test and this trial. It has a purpose. There's a reason behind the suffering, and in fact, sometimes I like to give the example that you know we all have children. If you give your child the video game and they plug it in, and in the video game there's no villains, there's no barriers, there's no challenges, there's no levels, it's just you running around in a world without any obstacles.
Right.
No child would like that story. So the human being that we're created in a world with challenges and opportunities and
Right. And that
happiness and
the
sadness.
parenting gives a really good illustration here. Is it the case would a good parent always give the child what they want? And I say the answer to that is no. Sometimes you're going to let your child go through something that's painful because you have a bigger view of what's at stake here than the child does. And that can actually be a kindness.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, so I'll move on to my last question. I guess this is related to mesotheism. You write, despite the complete rationality of the case for the intelligent design of life, there is just no way to make that conclusion acceptable to people who want to believe science has disproved God. The truth is quite the opposite, which is distinctly uncomfortable for some. Perhaps this explains why some people react so viscerally. Not that idea is illegitimate, but that the opposite, it's painfully legitimate.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's easy if you want atheism to be true. And by the way, I quote at some length, my favorite atheist writer is Thomas Nagel, and I quote him in the book. And he's two things I like about him. He's a philosopher of mind, and he acknowledges that his atheism does not come out of science. It's not a rational thing. It's just a gut thing for him. He says um, he suffers from a cosmic authority problem. He doesn't want this to be a universe that has God over it. And I think that's just remarkably frank. And I love his honesty about that. Um,
Mm.
but he also recognizes the problems with materialism, in that materialism and Darwinism cannot explain consciousness, cognition, and moral sense.
Mm.
Okay, so that's how he comes to his rejection of materialism, even though he's an atheist, and he took it a lot of flack for it. Oh, now I've diverged enough from your question. What were you asking me to comment on?
No, no, it was basically the way you end your book with a touch of
Oh,
mesotheism, where
why
people don't
people?
want to. Yeah.
Why there will be this visceral reaction? Um, yeah, I think if I were an atheist who were committed to atheism, I would not feel as though I need to reply or respond or comment on um, a very silly and goofy um, argument that God exists or that atheism is wrong. But the more intellectual depth an argument has, and the more apparent grounding it has in scientific investigation, the more uncomfortable I would be with it, because now it's pushing up. Now I have to acknowledge it because it seems to be it seems to have a weight behind it that I can't ignore, and everyone else is going to see that I'm ignoring it if I do ignore, and they'll think I have no answer to this. So that's the sort of thing that would make me uncomfortable. And if you look at kind of the history of ID and how ID proponents have been treated, you see exactly this. You see people going ballistic at times when they feel as though the farm is in jeopardy. The whole game is going to be exposed, and that's the last thing you want to have happen. Then you try to find a way to deplatform or discredit or divert attention. And so there's a lot of this uh, not fair play, and I've been a victim of that. I lost my position in Cambridge at the Medical Research Council Center, and it was because it wasn't because the director was rabidly anti-design. It's because the director recognized um, there's a lot of pressure against this, and he didn't want to be in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Understandably, because when things get ugly, and this isn't your issue, he just didn't want to have anything to do with it. So
Mm.
yeah, it gets ugly at times.
Yeah, I can imagine the pressure. I mean, if Dennis Noble's meeting in 2016, New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, if that nearly got cancelled, then what about someone working without the support of many of the fellows of the Royal Society? It would be a very tough
Yeah.
call. The last thing I want to ask you just before we end is Philip Johnson recommended your book, and he said it was a joy to read, and he found it very insightful. And one of the things I love about Johnson is because he was a lawyer, he liked to get to the core of the issue. And for him, it was always theism versus naturalism. Everything else was being colored by those perspectives. To end the stream, what is your thoughts on this? Is this the real issue for you still today?
Yes, and I think this is why um, plate tectonics was disruptive. Quantum theory was disruptive. There are all kinds of disruptive things that happen in science, but this is something that's not just disruptive to your scientific theory, it's disruptive to your view of reality, to your worldview. And that's far more disruptive because people sense that if design is right and naturalism, materialism is wrong, then we need to think about everything differently. And there's a moral component to it. So there's actually kind of a guilt thing that comes into play if you feel like, well, if those guys are right and I'm wrong, then I'm doing something wrong, something morally wrong. And that's a hard thing to swallow. So, yeah, I think it has that complexity to it. But you can't run away from things just because they're hard.
Brilliant. That's actually a fantastic way to end the stream. So, Doug, for anyone that wants to follow you or uh, maybe you're working on something, would you like anyone to, would you like to recommend anything for people to follow up?
I'm not on another book project right now. I use X occasionally, so my one social media is Doug Axe at Doug Axe. That's my X handle. I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I'm going to be honest, but I have not given up on it, and I'm thinking of ramping up. But anyway, that's my one social media tag. I'm going to wait on the next book. I'm thinking of doing something on AI actually. So I don't know if you do talks on AI. And my thing on AI is I'm concerned that AI is causing confusion about what a human is and what a machine is. So it's really this philosophical thing. AI is going to do great things. It's going to be used for bad things, like every tool, but for good things as well. But I'm more concerned about it causing confusion. And so there could be a book coming out on that.
That would be amazing. In my last interview with Thomas Lawrence Kuhn, this idea of AI being conscious came up, and he puts the question back to the questioner. Well, what do you mean by consciousness? I mean, it's your theory of consciousness which dictates whether you believe AI is conscious and
Right.
whether it can be human. So these are some really interesting ideas. So thank you so much, Professor Doug. I would love to have you back at some point, maybe a year from now when you have your new book.
That'd be great. I've enjoyed it.
All right.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been delightful speaking to you tonight.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.